Hi everyone, hope you're well and this video finds you safe and sound wherever you might be. My name's Kieran Howle, I'm a sports scientist here at Catapult. I've been with the company for nearly 5 years and I moved into this role after 8 years in professional sport. I started in the National Rugby League in 2008 and then moved into professional football or soccer after that. So there's a lot of questions going around at the moment as a result of the COVID-19 situation and what effect that might have on the various leagues around the world in terms of reduced season duration and then the consequences of that potentially being reduced pre-seasons and periods where there's increased fixture congestion of matches. So there are two critical issues that we want to address in this presentation today. I completed my PhD on the effects of congested scheduling in football and what effect it has on load, recovery and injury rates. So hopefully I can draw on some of that in terms of the knowledge that I've gained and be able to provide some valuable insights for teams and potentially provide some solutions for how you might go about navigating those consequences of the current situation. So just an overview for the presentation. I want to define firstly what congested schedules are and touch on the literature that exists. Hopefully we can draw upon that when looking at my own personal findings and then ultimately a case study for the team that I was involved in that went through a period of congested scheduling as well. So firstly, what are congested schedules? So they're periods of increased match demands within a season, and typically they result when additional competitions are played. So Champions League, UEFA competitions. As a result of the current situation with coronavirus, that's obviously going to potentially have a similar impact where teams are playing lots of matches as a result of reduced seasons. Traditionally, it's common in Europe where teams can play anywhere between 50 and 70 games. And those increased exposures do create periods of acute and prolonged congestion. And it's important to define those and differentiate them. So acute congested schedules typically refer to 2 or 3 games that are separated by 4 or less days of recovery, often referred to as multi-matches. So acute periods that are in isolation. And that's opposed to prolonged congested schedules, which happen over longer periods, so often over 20 days. There's short recovery times of 3 to 4 days between all games that exist within that period. If we look at the literature that does exist on both acute and prolonged congested schedules, firstly starting with this paper, which focused on acute congested periods where there was less versus greater than 3 days of recovery, and just looking at match outcomes, so win-loss. And you can see that was largely unaffected by those reduced recovery times. So it seems as though the actual outcome of matches is unaffected by that congested scheduling. If we look at physical performance, so again, firstly looking at acute and 2 versus 1 match weeks, you can see that the external load in terms of output from players is very similar between those 1 and 2 match weeks, which would suggest that players are resilient enough to withstand those short recovery times in terms of actual external output. Similar findings when we look at a period of prolonged congestion. So this paper looking at 8 matches that were played in 26 days, and they found that the highest physical output was actually on match 7. So again, suggesting that there's no real change in physical performance for either acute or prolonged congested periods. But what about injury? So injury, if we look at acute congested schedules first in terms of the risk ratio associated with them, and when less than 4 or greater than 6 days of recovery exist between games, you can see that those rates aren't really changed, except for one form of competition there in Europa League games. But outside of that, risk ratios for injury occurrence didn't really change. And the same thing was found when comparing less than or greater than 3 days of recovery as well. So mixed findings when you look at the actual findings between those different league matches, but nothing really touching on severity. That similar data set was also used later on and more recently, where they compared training injury rates from acute congested periods as well. So less than 3 days of recovery versus when there's 4, 5, 6 or 7 to 10 days and looking at that injury rate. And you can see there that it was unchanged depending on that recovery time. So no real difference between the recovery and the short turnaround. In contrast, if we look at this study here, firstly by Dalel, this looked at a prolonged congested period. So this particular paper, there was 3 separate periods of prolonged congestion where 6 matches were played, and they looked at the injury rates across those 3 pulled together. Overall, they found that the match injury rate did increase in congested periods, most likely as a result of just increased match exposure. And there was also a reduction in training injuries in that congested period. Overall, that meant that the total injury rate didn't change between congested and non-congested. So potentially just more injuries as a result of more match exposure. This study, looking at acute congested periods on the right here, DuPont, this looked at 2 versus 1 match weeks. And as opposed to the prolonged paper previously, they found that overall match and training injury rates did increase in those acute 2 versus 1 match weeks. And also an increase in severity of injury, so particularly to muscle and tendon injuries. So moderate to severe injuries increased. There was an increase in reoccurrence, but overall, a mixed finding in terms of injury between those acute and prolonged congested periods. Recovery, so this paper looked at 3 versus 1 match weeks and just focused on the more high intense actions in games as a surrogate to infer recovery. They found that those higher intensity values didn't change across those 3 games, meaning that players are able to maintain that physical workload. When looking at subjective recovery, this paper also looking at 3 versus 1 match weeks, they found that players perceptually had a perceived recovery, a perceived reduction in recovery when there was 3 versus 1 match played in a week. Objectively though, with a different variety of measures there, squat jumps, counter movement jumps, and 10 and 20 meter sprints, they found that on those tests, players didn't have a reduction in recovery when comparing 3 versus 1 match week. So perceptual recovery reduced, but no decrease in objective measures. In this last paper, 2 versus 1 match weeks, they found that similar findings in terms of objective recovery, except for counter movement jumps, which were different in the 2-game week versus the 1-game week. So decreased subjective recovery during those acute congested periods, but there's no real measure so far for reduced physical recovery in those prolonged congested schedules. So the focus of the research to date is mainly on those acute congested periods. From my own personal perspective, so this was based on the team that I worked at within Australian football. So I think our findings were quite different from the European-centric research that I've shown thus far. So in Australia, we have smaller squad sizes potentially when compared to European football. We also have salary caps, which is very important. So at the time of my employment at the club, we had a salary cap of 2.5 million. As a result of that, the depth in squads in Australia is probably not as high quality as European football. As a result, that means that there's implications on player rotation. So we might not be able to rotate the squad as frequently as those in Europe. And as a result, we found quite different findings. So for injury rates, firstly looking at training, I think most significantly, we found an increase in single versus multi-match weeks and seasons that had the greatest scheduling of matches. So overall, total match and training injury rates increased, but most different to the European research, probably that increase in training injury rates. When looking at recovery during those acute congested periods, so firstly, subjective wellness, that was reduced following a single match week when compared to baseline. So as you would expect, one single game resulting in a depression in wellness up to 72 hours post-match. But when the players played 2 games in a week, that wellness response was even further suppressed. So we seem to have a prolonged reduction in that wellness response after a 2-match compared to a 1-match week only. When looking at objective measures, so we looked at a hamstring active knee extension, knee to wall, sit and reach, and a hip abduction squeeze test. And the hip abduction squeeze test was the main one for us that highlighted some reduction and followed a similar trend to what we saw with perceived wellness. So reduced following the first match within a week, and then even further reduced following the second match within a week, potentially suggesting a prolonged recovery when players are engaged in 2 games within a week. In the prolonged congested schedule, so a different paper here that we looked at with a period of 36 days where 11 matches were played. On average, I think there was 3.2 days of recovery between each game in the congested period. And as a result, we found that total match and training injury rates increased when compared to a non-congested period that was a matched time frame, but a reduced number of games, only being 4. When looking at load, this was quite interesting. So you can see here that mean total load was significantly decreased in the congested period, and that was despite a significant increase that was actually double in terms of match load. So much higher match load, obviously more match exposures, but a significantly different mean total load, which was training and match load combined. So clearly we just had to focus on recovery during that congested period, and we couldn't get any load into players. One of the other interesting points here was that the acute chronic workload ratio didn't change between periods. Given the stachotic nature of the loads during those congested periods, I would have expected a difference to be found between the ACWRs between the 2 periods, but the preceding loads that variable obviously takes into account might not have been sensitive for those fluctuations or changes in load that we were experiencing. So for me, it wasn't a measure that really revealed too much, which was interesting as well. Recovery during those prolonged congested periods. So here we just looked at perceived recovery in terms of wellness, again, to infer recovery. And we looked at that non-congested versus congested period and pulled the wellness profile from all games from those 2 periods to create an average. So following the match, 24 hours post, pretty similar profiles in terms of the reduced wellness at 24 hours. And then at 48, after a single match, starting to improve back to baseline, ultimately back to baseline at 72 hours post. But you can see in the congested period at 48 hours post, that wellness response still being quite reduced. So again, just suggesting that prolonged recovery profile following multi-match weeks and also games played within those prolonged congested periods. So hopefully that gives you guys some background on the research that does exist, and you're able to see how some of those findings may be incorporated into how you actually go about navigating through these periods of congestion. Just to provide you with some more information as well, I want to go through a case study. So my own individual experience from the team that I was involved with and how we went about dealing with the challenges associated with not only reduced pre-seasons, but also fixture congestion throughout. So just a snapshot for the team that I was involved with. Season 1 was very normal, so 27 home and away games. But because of the success we had in that season, we did qualify for Asian Champions League in subsequent years. So in Season 2, we had the group stages, quarterfinals of that competition. And then moving into Season 3, we had the semi-finals and the finals of that competition, which we ultimately won, and then qualified for the FIFA Club World Cup. So playing in those different competitions led to a significant increase in the amount of matches that needed to be played, and as a result, we had to navigate through those times. Before I go into how we dealt with scheduling and prescription of load throughout those congested weeks, I just want to focus on what we did during normal scheduling, including pre-season, just to give some of that some context. So what we're looking at here is just a normal pre-season week. Probably pretty early on in the pre-season where we're starting to look to develop some of those physical capabilities that players need for football. So starting off on a Monday, looking at an aerobic session, lots of very high speed running, big long MAS grids that were significant in terms of distances, really trying to develop those aerobic capacities. And then moving into a Tuesday where we're focused on repeat speed, we're trying to get at least 300 to 400 meters of maximal speed out of players throughout those sessions, focusing on intervals as well, but a lot sharper movements. So really trying to focus on those qualities. That was a pretty heavy day, so as a result, we'd have a quite a light day on a Wednesday midweek, focus on recovery before going into a similar sort of format towards the end of the week. So aerobic and repeat speed again, but increasing the load even more before we went into the weekend off. You can see the color scheme that we kind of worked towards as well. So just to help give us a better way to communicate what those predictive loads were with coaches. Sometimes when we spoke about RPEs, it was a bit of an ethereal number and the coaching staff weren't really sure what that meant. So we looked to implement this sort of system where we would say, okay, we're looking to hit an RPE today of 7. Straight away, the coaches knew that that meant their session was going to go between 75 to 85 minutes. So just trying to not control what the coaches were doing, but just to try and help guide what they were to expect so that we could maintain our periodization in line with what was planned. This was the pre-season from season 2, so without any reduction in the length of that pre-season as a result of additional competitions. This was just a normal pre-season and how we went about things. So we would start with a two-week intro and then a pre-season from 1 to 10 weeks. So you can see we didn't really implement games until week 4, and even at that stage, just single match weeks. You could see the predictive minutes there and then the actual minutes that were recorded along with the RPEs and associated load. We were sticking to 4-week blocks, so 3 weeks of loading followed by a deload week, and really just trying to build our players in terms of their conditioning throughout that period. Obviously, there's a significant influence of the teachings and the tactical requirements as well from the coaches, but there was also, of course, a big focus on developing those physical capabilities. Here you can see the training load and associated wellness over that pre-season. So again, those 3 weeks of incremental loading followed by a download week, and then tapering off towards the end of that pre-season before the season proper. Also looking at the change in load between those weeks. So that's obviously quite topical at the moment, and there's some research that does suggest that as percentages of load increase in terms of their value, there's also an exponential increase in the amount of injury risk. So once we go above sort of 10, 11, 12% increases in load, injury risk does increase as well. Although that was something we looked at, I think we took more importance on that for changes in high speed and very high speed running. In terms of our overall load, I think it was good to have some fluctuation between those weeks, because at the end of the day, players are going to be exposed to that as a result of seasons where multiple matches might be played on 1 week and then the next goes back to a single match week. Because of those circumstances, it is very difficult to maintain a consistent loading. So therefore, having some fluctuation in load is going to better prepare players and build resilience in those capabilities, so that when we do experience those changes in season, players can better cope with those demands. I often use the analogy of someone doing bench press in the gym. If you're always doing 3 sets of 60 kilos, when you do switch it out and go to 3 sets of 100 kilos, for example, you're going to be very, very sore after making that change. Your body, you're going to have significant DOMs. You're not going to recover. It's going to take a lot longer as well to recover. But if you always make changes between those two loads over time, you're going to adapt. Your body's going to be able to recover quicker, and you can cope with those sorts of changes in load. And the same sort of rationale is applicable here to a pre-season, where we're trying to build that resilience and get players to adapt to those sorts of changes and distributions in load. Here, looking at training load versus injury incidence, so always trying to keep track of that against our loads. I think this pre-season was fairly uneventful. It was fairly straightforward. So as a result, our injury incidence was quite low. But it's always still important to look at injury against your load to try and get an understanding of those loads are doing what they need to and you're not overstressing the athletes. So moving into season and the normal micro cycle that we would focus on, at first we obviously have a match, which is followed by recovery strategies in that first 24 to 48 hours. Once we have players that are more adequately recovered, we can move into loading strategies in the middle of the week. So increase in volume and potentially still a reduced intensity when we have those loading strategies midweek. As we start to taper off into the following match, we'll start to reduce volume, increase intensity, and focus on those more agility, repeat speed movements towards the back end of the week, sharpening our players up for that subsequent game. You can see that in more detail here. So looking at the actual loads prescribed across those normal one match week periodizations. This is an FFA model that's proposed by the Football Federation in Australia for clubs. There is some really good points of this model. It is primarily focused on conditioning players with the ball at their feet. There's a lot of small-sided games and a lot of conditioning focus through actual drills and the development of aerobic capacity through that. The issue with this model is that by just using small-sided games and drills themselves to get that conditioning aspect for players, within those drills, individual players may hide, and as a result, you're not really developing those capacities. So we favoured a different model, and this was what we sought to implement. So a match on a Saturday followed by a day off. That was for players completely at home, so giving them a chance to sleep at home in their own beds, sleep in, spend time with their families, recover not only physically but also mentally before coming back into the club at 48 hours post. That was a very standardized session, which was obviously focused on recovery, very low distances, very little, if any, high-speed running and very high-speed running. Again, just focusing on recovery so that we can, at 72 hours, with players fully recovered, look to get some load in. So not only through small-sided games and development of those physical capabilities through training, but also some conditioning, so running without the ball, MAS style conditioning sessions as well. And you can see the loads there with those. If that was a particularly big day and the boss was in a good mood, the following day might be off, or it would be in at the club and a very light recovery day. That would give us then a chance to focus on some speed and reaction style movements towards the back end of the week. So again, looking to just sharpen players up and switch that activation on before they start to go into that subsequent game the following Saturday. That all works well during the normal scheduling of matches when there's only one per week, but that gets thrown out the window when you obviously have a lot more matches to be played. So for us specifically, in Season 3, we had 5 different competition formats we were playing across. So the domestic A-League competition, the ACL, quarterfinals, semi-finals, and the final. We had the group stage of the ACL as well in the following year of that competition, the FFA Cup, and then the FIFA Club World Cup too. So those different formats resulted in a lack of training load that we were able to get into players, particularly in that pre-season of Season 3, which I'll go into in more detail. There was a lot of travel, and because we were tapering off not just for one, but often 2 matches within a week, we were only really able to focus on recovery, and we weren't able to get a lot of that loading in like we had previously. Always, again, a need to balance that training and recovery aspect. So, how much is too much and not enough, and how much time do we need to allow players to recover. We want to build resilience for our players, but we also want to allow them to recover sufficiently. There was also minimal time off between Season 2 and 3. So a reduced time off, which ultimately was leading into a reduced pre-season in Season 3. Just some of the madness that we went through. So week 7 of pre-season was our first official match. Week 8 of pre-season, some really important games. So some quarterfinals for the ACL against a pretty big team from China who spent a lot of money on transfers. So 3rd highest behind Chelsea and Man City, which was pretty significant for our club from Australia to go up against with our salary cap of $2.5 million. In week 10 of that pre-season, we went to Dubai for a heat acclimatization camp. That was really to put us in a good position if we were to progress in that ACL competition, where the finals were ultimately going to be held in the Middle East. So by the time we got to season in week 1, we'd already done a lot of travel to the Middle East, Asia for China games, and then to Korea as well for the semi-final of the ACL. The week 3 of in-season was when those finals of the ACL were played. Week 10 in-season, FIFA Club World Cup, and then week 14 of in-season, the following year of that ACL competition started. So all up, 50 games played in that season. That's almost double of what would normally be played in a regular domestic Australian competition. So a lot of things that we had to navigate through. You can see how that changed our periodization. So I think our 1 week periodization really set us up in a good way for those 2 match weeks. And you can see we didn't really change a whole lot there. So obviously the loads changed significantly, but a similar distribution in the week. So a Saturday game followed by a travel and or recovery. So if it was an away game, and we're traveling home on a bus or a flight, then we obviously want to practice the best recovery measures that we can. So giving the players plenty of time to rest. If they're on the bus, getting up and walking around. If they're on a plane, really focusing on hydration, practicing good sleep hygiene. So don't allow the players to be sitting there with the TV on, try and put that sleep mask on and get some rest. Ultimately setting us up in a good position when we are back at the club at 48 hours post to have a bit of a recovery session, but then also focus on obviously the tactical development leading into the next game. Then on the Wednesday, again, travel and recovery, which puts us in a position where we were able to get 2 days of lead in prior to the next game on a Saturday. Again, you can see pretty reduced loads in terms of our banded running, so high and very high speed running, quite low, and even our overall distances pretty far down. And the only real exposure to load that players were getting through those weeks is through matches. Also, one of the other points that I think I'd highlight is for the players that aren't playing. So for the squad that plays, this was the periodization that we followed. For the guys that were used as substitutes within the matches or that made up part of the squad that didn't play both of the games within the week, we looked to top them up on the same day as the game was played. So usually we would get them in prior to the match, give them a really hard, 60, 90-minute session prior to the game so that everybody was on a similar timeline in terms of their own recovery. And here you can see the forced microcycle changes that result from those congested 2-match weeks. So in the previous slide that I looked at, going from a match, recovery, loading, tapering back to another match. When we have 2 games within a week, we often find that we're going straight from a match, straight into another game, and then ultimately into another. So we're not getting enough time to allow players sufficient recovery. So there's always that need to try and balance between, load, recovery, working with the coaches, trying to make sure that the sessions between those games, you're not getting too much work into the players and you're only really getting any physical load into players as a result of those games. Just to give you guys, I guess, some ideas around that now. So I just want to focus on our monitoring system. So I'm not going to go into every aspect of it because that's probably another discussion, but I just want to focus on the key elements of this that we would look to change or potential ways that we tried to look at monitoring the players more closely during these periods of congested scheduling. That all starts with the preseason, so planning. This is the actual preseason from season 3, so where we had those significant increases in match demands, as a result of those different competition formats. So first 2 weeks were intro weeks. With the whole situation at the moment within the world, these 2 intro weeks probably lend themselves well to players doing them in isolation and trying to get some sort of remote monitoring as well. There's some presentations online at the moment that we've put together with Toronto FC, which do go into potential ways to monitor players while they're remote. So you could probably take a look at that for some ideas. But I think those 2 weeks for us, when traditionally we'd have the players in at the club, just really heavily focused on those running demands and trying to build that aerobic base. No real no real drills with the ball at the player's feet. Really just heavily focused on MAS running, intervals, lots of repeat speed and high intensity work just to try and get that base before we went into pre-season proper. You can see pre-season proper there, so weeks 1 and 2, and then games already starting on week 3. So, with the current situation, if teams do have, if any of the teams out there do have reduced pre-seasons, hopefully this gives you guys some ideas. I'm not saying this is the exact way to do things, but hopefully it just does, give you guys a little bit of insight into ways that you might be able to handle your altered pre-seasons. So weeks 1, week 2, into games already by week 3. When we introduced games, we were already looking at playing 2-game weeks. Not 2 full games, but probably 1.5 for players across the squad, because we had ACL games starting in week 7 of actual preseason. So important to start to get that game time into the players. There's no, obviously, conditioning that is as good as a game, so trying to introduce that pretty early, and 2 games a week as well from pretty early on to try and build into what we were going to be experiencing, not only towards the end of that preseason, but also throughout different phases of the competition where we had acute and prolonged periods of congestion. Still trying to maintain somewhat of that aspect of 3 weeks on, 1 week off, but that was very difficult given the sorts of games that we had to play in that preseason. So, I'll have this presentation shared on the Catapult community as well. So if you guys want to see these things and the actual prescribed loads in more detail, you'll be able to look at that after as well. So the actual loads that we did record, not a very pretty slide, but I just wanted to give you guys some context for those weeks, sort of 1 through 15, what the actual loads that we did record. So total physical load, just RPE load, distance, intensity, and then you're running in bands. So high speed running, 14.4 to 19.8 kilometers per hour, and very high speed above 19.8. You can see some pretty big weeks, depending on what competition you currently reside in, but some pretty big weeks where we were having those 2-game weeks, and then really trying to reduce the load in between. So, not saying that this is the ideal way to handle that preseason, and these might not have been the absolute best loads that we could have implemented, but this is what we did anyway throughout that time, and it might give you guys some ideas, or at least a starting point when you're looking at programming across those preseasons. And then just looking, in more detail at the high speed running. So you can see, really trying to build that base early on, and then we tapered right off when we came in towards matches. So, high speed running, anywhere between sort of 1 kilometer to 1.5 potentially in a game. So you can see those 2-game weeks. That was pretty much the only time we were getting high speed out of the players towards the back end of the preseason. Only really match-based high-speed running, but we tried to build that base pretty early on. And then the similar sort of thing for very high-speed running. So again, early on getting into the players, we tapered right off, and then we were only really exposing players to that as a result of the matches that they were playing once we got to the back end of preseason. And of course, tapering off at that preseason as well for season proper in the A-League. We relied pretty heavily on our training drill database. Again, normally we would, but even more importance placed on this during those congested weeks. So for us, everything started with just programming for our training session. So getting our drills that we were going to do that day, putting them into this database, and then that would obviously give us a total of what we would predict to happen during that training session based on the drills. And as we accumulated throughout the week, if this was session 1, we would also add session 2 and session 3 to that, and that would give us a running total of the average week. So always trying to make things relative. That percentage of an average week, again, that was for normal scheduling, but during 2-match or multi-match weeks, that average or norm week that we were comparing our predictive loads to was a 2-match week. So, that would obviously give us an idea if we're prescribing too much or not as much based on previous multi-match weeks as well. Our drill database, we coded into 3 2s and 1s. So drills that were high, medium, and low load. So on certain days, whether it was a heavier day or a lighter day, recovery focused or conditioning focused, we'd also give the coaches the appropriate drills to pick from. So, ones primarily and maybe a 2 for a recovery day, and then 3s and 2s if the day was a bit heavier. So always trying to give the coaches the creative freedom to pick the drills that they want, but somewhat in line with the sorts of loads that we were trying to stick to in terms of our periodization. And these drill databases did help us with that. Always measuring plan v actual, so our predictive loads matched up against our actual. If there was something significantly out there, then we can alter our subsequent training sessions. So always trying to be adaptive. Coaches often go for 5, 10, 15 minutes over time if they're trying to focus on scoring that last goal or something when they're doing a shape drill. And as a result, sometimes your numbers get blown out. So you need to be reactive to that and be able to adapt. And that really does help when you've got some sort of load prescription template as well. It's also important to think about how drills are structured in terms of whether they're extensive or intensive. So the drill here that we're looking at on the left, extensive drill, lots of distance, high speed running, etc. A big external load that you're getting from that drill, and then versus an intensive one on the right. So small-sided games, reduced area, shorter, sharp movements, but you're also saving the sort of distances that are in the player legs. So, we tried to be very careful with the sorts of drills that we were also selecting throughout those congested weeks, making sure that if we were, towards the back end of the week and players had already done, enough or more load than we were expecting or hoping for, then we're obviously going to use more intensive drills. One of the other things which I'll probably touch on when I go into some of the reporting methods, but I think it's important here to just note too how you can, change individual players' requirements in a drill based on where they're at any given time point during a week. So, if one certain player's had a particularly big week, you may want to adapt what he does in a specific drill. Coaches are often very obviously picky about their player numbers in a training session. They don't want to have reduced numbers. If they have 16 players, that's what they're going to have, and there's no discussion around it. So if there is a player that you want to rest and you can't really affect the coach's numbers, that player might just sit as a bouncer on a possession drill, for example. That way you're reducing the actual meters that he's running, but he's still involved in the drill, still getting a cardiovascular response, and he's still part of the training session, but he's still manipulating what he does. And I think that's important across all drills and small-sided games in particular. So just understanding what things are going to change the intensity of your drills. And this becomes, again, just increasingly important during those congested weeks. Really understanding your drills and the profile of them, but then understanding what things can reduce the intensity too. So, obviously increased in intensity when there's a smaller amount of players, when they're taking less touches on the ball. If the coach is on the side of the pitch, verbally screaming at them, that obviously increases the intensity. So there is things that we can do, to reduce that intensity, and particularly if it's a 2-match week, those are the sorts of things that we may need to manipulate so that we can, better navigate through those sorts of weeks and reduce players' injury risk. So in terms of actual monitoring of those loads, so both training and match loads, I won't touch on everything, and this is not a very nice looking slide, but just something that I wanted to put in and highlight. Something that we always were looking at specifically in these multi-match weeks was not only our absolute load, but again those changes in load between the weeks, and also trying to make sure that we monitored that per the individual. So different players also respond obviously very differently to load, and some can withstand those big fluctuations or big changes in load, while others just can't. There's older, more experienced players that have been around for a while. They often, up until a certain age, can cope with load better, whereas younger players might not. So always, even with the change in load for us, we looked at that in terms of relative terms for each individual player. if a player had been exposed to big changes or big fluctuations in load previously, then it's probably something, like this player here, for example, that we wouldn't choose to highlight. Whereas other players, bigger changes in load for them, might be more significant and worth highlighting. So always trying to make things relative to the individual and probably putting more of a lens on it during a congested week. Load monitoring, again, so across a normal week, our Monday through Sunday, what sort of loads we were doing on each of those individual sessions for each of our metrics that we were looking at. We would also always traffic light that for flags based on, a relative week. So, what's our normal week and and this week compared to that. Within a 2-match week, again, this relative reporting would change. So we're not comparing to normal 1-match weeks, always comparing, to what that current week is. So 2-match week compared to a 2-match week. And that was the same across players' daily loads as well. So whichever metric we're looking at, distance, high speed, very high speed running, for example. The chart on the left, looking at the player's absolute load for that week, so how much distance accumulated, and then on the right, the percentage of a normal week, so relative reporting. And, that really gave us a lot of insight to where players were at for any given time in a week. As we put in our loads on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and kept adding to those loads, then our relative chart would also update. So if we were at, a Thursday already for any given week and a player was already at 80%, for example, of his high-speed running, we'd be like, okay, we really need to, taper this guy off. We need to reduce his loads. How do we do that? As I alluded to earlier, sometimes that meant changing what he was doing in a specific session and specific drills within that session, but always trying to make things relative to the individual. And then inside of that, also relative to the individual based on the week that we were currently in and whether it was a congested or non-congested week. So these relative values within multi-match weeks were also compared to players' relative multi-match weeks as well. Seasonal reporting, so important also as well, not to just look at the loads within individual days and weeks, but across the season and how your loads are actually fitting in with that longer term, in those longer term macro cycles as well. So you can see in the dotted line at the back of these charts that represents the previous season, and then the blue line is the current season. So we had a pretty tumultuous pre-season with some pretty stachotic loads. So big spike here in and around that ACL time, and then trying to taper off before the season proper. So a lot of what we'd done in the past was really thrown out the window, and those monitoring systems that we had just looked at, really helped us to try and navigate through periods where loads weren't really reflective of what we had been exposed to in the past. Recovery monitoring, so this is obviously a really important one during these times as well. So the recovery scores that we did look at, so wellness, first of all, subjectively, and also a recovery score. We looked at the match load to give all of these recovery measures just some context, and the things that we looked at as well, groin squeeze as far as an objective measure, as well as hamstring flexibility, knee to wall, and a USG on some days as well. Just a little bit of an idea how we looked at that. So, any given day, what all of those measures players tested at, what that is compared to average in their previous weeks. We've got the match load there just to give our numbers some context. And again, players flagging in red if they were above, their normative values. In, again, congested weeks, those norms were again changed. Our wellness, so we looked at wellness profiles for each individual player for where they were at today and what their normal trend line looked like. So if a player was elevated, compared to how he normally responds, we would obviously flag that. And that would broker a conversation with an athlete primarily, not to go any further than that sometimes. Our recovery visual analog scale, and then most importantly for us, our groin squeeze. So you can see the recovery measures there. Obviously not what the players themselves, but the actual ones that we were implementing. Again, the groin squeeze, the most important for us. It wasn't a self-administered groin squeeze like this one. We had the players come through, obviously, into the gym in the mornings. They would complete their wellness, and then they'd come into the physio rooms and do their recovery scores. I had the players just on the benches in the physio room, and then would go through their groin squeeze. Players' scores were always compared to their normative values, and any flags, we addressed when we saw them. One of the main things that I liked about doing a groin squeeze is just also the opportunity to speak with the athlete. So while you're actually there administering the test, having them on the bench, they're relaxed. They're in the physio room. They're usually pretty comfortable in there and have a bit of banter. So they feel comfortable, and then you can get a bit more of an insight into how they're actually feeling. So, perform the groin squeeze. Do you have any pain while you're doing that? Okay, why do you have pain? What did you do after training yesterday? Did you recover well after the game? Just a really good opportunity to have a discussion with the athlete as well. Physio monitoring and injury reporting. So something else we always looked at and constantly used to put a lens on what we were doing and to see whether it was actually working or not. So always looking at load and how injuries tracked against that on the right. And also importantly, one of the things we looked at was load and how that responded to physio treatment. So that gave us a pretty good idea and sometimes would precede patterns in injury. So as load increased, potentially the need for treatment from the physio also increased. And if that happened, then we might have had a subsequent increase in injury risk as well. So, primarily those increases in injury and physio treatments would follow spikes in load. But for us, predominantly spikes in load for high and very high speed running, not total load. So another aspect that really helped us through that congested period was this daily prehab program. So this was something that the players did when they first came into the gym in the mornings. So they'd get down and have a release on the foam roller and then go through a mobility and activation protocol. So you could see the exercises there. This was done at all times, but there was a greater focus put on it during those congested 2-match weeks. So in season 3, the physiotherapist also identified individual weaknesses that players might have had and incorporated further exercises into this daily prehab program as well. But the players would do this from start to finish every single morning. So not only developing those skills long term in terms of the physical capacities over a longer period of time, but also just helping day to day and helping to maximize that recovery between games as well. One of the other things that we felt was very beneficial for this was that players were extremely warm by the time they actually went onto the pitch for training. So instead of spending a longer time on the warm-up, getting players up to speed, we could really hit the ground running in those training sessions and really take advantage of this prehab program that the players had already gone through. So particularly during congested schedules where we're trying to minimize the duration of some sessions out on the pitch, we really need to take advantage and optimize the time while they are on the field. So instead of spending further time trying to get the players ready to go, by doing this prehab program, we could get into training a lot faster and potentially start at a higher intensity. You can see some of the exercises there. So the groin board, just opening up those groins, single-legged squats, Bosu ball volleys, just some of the exercises. Another thing that we always do, probably towards the end of the season, but always looking at that physio injury monitoring, relationship with load. At the end of the season, we sort of put a lens on this and really delve into it to see if the monitoring system that we did employ was actually working. So when we looked at all of our injuries and the loads of the current week of injury, the week preceding and 2 weeks prior, we did see a bit of a pattern where there was these big changes in high speed running, not so much total load, but when there was a big change in high speed running in 2 weeks prior and then the week prior, there was often an injury occurrence in the following week. So that was something that we identified and was pretty unique early on, I guess, within our monitoring, and something that we then focused on in seasons 2 and 3 as well. This data also formed an honours thesis, so looking at the workloads preceding injury in professional football. So just in summary, research on congested schedules do report mixed findings, particularly in relation to recovery and injury. So it is just important to be aware of that and understanding how individual circumstances within teams are going to change those findings. They might not be applicable to everybody. Congested schedules are dependent, again, on those unique aspects. So squad sizes, the playing depth within your squad, playing experience, so the age group of your squad as well, and then coaching and tactical styles is obviously going to have a big influence as well. For Australian football, and what we've found quite different to European football, is that big implication for the depth in your squad, and how that results in potentially a lack of rotation of players. So that is, the number one finding from the majority of research in this area, is to suggest that increased player rotation does minimize injury risk. And that is fine if you've got 2 players for every position and you can rotate accordingly. But that becomes more difficult when you obviously don't have as much of a squad to be able to choose from for each game day. So, the things that I've presented thus far in this presentation were applicable to us within the current team. But player rotation, based on part of these individual circumstances, will play a big part in navigating through congested periods. I'll say that there's no blueprint that exists for ideal load management either, so there's no real templates or anything to go off during those times. You do have to be adaptable to the situation. If it does feel like there's more load being placed onto players than there really should be, then you obviously need to increase recovery and potentially reduce those loads, but no real blueprint exists. So hopefully some of the loads that I've shared throughout this presentation give you something to go off, and it might help you within your own programming during these periods. Is a change in flagging and monitoring required? As I shared throughout the training monitoring aspect of the presentation, we did change what flags were created for players based on what constituted a normal week. When we went into 2-match weeks or periods of prolonged congestion, those normative values changed in what we were making then our flags and everything based on. So, you might need to look at addressing some of those changes. And then lastly, I just finished by saying you really do need to focus on recovery, but also control the controllables. There's a lot of things that happen outside of your influence as a practitioner, including, the effective coaching staff. So I think you really need to control what you're able to. If that means you're in control of the warm-up, and potentially the day before the coaches, ran over time and you potentially did more load than you were hoping for, then potentially you could reduce the time of your warm-up or change the focus of that warm-up from an agility-based warm-up to a more recovery-focused warm-up. So control what you're able to control, and just do what you can in these periods. Be adaptable and flexible, because your plans will have to change in some form or another throughout congested periods. So thanks for your attention. I appreciate everybody watching this presentation. If you've got any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'm always up for a discussion on the effects of congested schedules and reduced pre-seasons and potential solutions around that. So if you'd like to further the discussion, please reach out. And also if you've got any questions. This presentation will live in the Catapult community, so if you need to watch it back and have a closer look at some of those loads, then please do so. And if you need more context or more detail around those as well, then please feel free to reach out. Thank you.